Welcome back, Diane, to Knowledge Nugget number 2. We accomplished a lot in our first one on what is personal brand, and we picked up on that conversation to really lead into what it isn't, to make sure we safeguard ourselves against the downside of branding, as well as why it's important to you and your career, even if you plan to stay the next 20 years where you're at today. What's the downside of branding? Have you seen any downside of branding? Almost. So if that's what branding is and what we should maybe be attracted to and pulled towards, what are those things that maybe branding isn't, that maybe people are thinking about and we need to help them move beyond?
Yeah, well, I think it's almost like any brand in the market, right?
Yeah.
Let's put personal branding on the side for a minute. If you had a company that just makes claims like we're the best soda, or we're the best, without anything to substantiate it, then you would diminish the value of the brand, right? So I think that really it's about thinking about what is your value. So and not bragging. It's not bragging. It's not being annoying. It's really just showing up as yourself and being your authentic self, and not telling people who you are and what your brand is, but rather showing it through your behaviors, how you do your work, what your values are, what you recognize in your team as a leader, and how you contribute to the broader organization.
That's really cool. So you mentioned it before, and I just want to elevate it up a little bit in this view of creating value. And I know I've encountered a lot of people say, I can't talk about myself. I'm not one of those folks that can hold an audience, and maybe on a negative side, an empty suit that shows up to talk about themselves but never deliver anything to the organization. Mm-hmm. So about creating value. You can get beyond that view about talking about yourself if it was, here's how I create value for my team, here's the value I create for my organization, here's the value I create for the community around me. So it's not talking about or bragging about yourself, it's the aspect of just saying, here's the value I bring. If you want it, pull me in. If not, maybe I fit somewhere else, correct?
Right. Yeah.
Good.
And I think it's different when you're in front of a big group.
Yeah.
But when you're one-on-one, it's also asking for some feedback. And there are ways to demonstrate your brand by saying, look, I really would appreciate some feedback. These are things I'm trying to do to bring value and differentiation to the organization. Here are the 3 or 4 things I'm focused on. That will already tell the story to your audience, whether it's one person or a group. And then asking for feedback to say, what are we doing well? What can we improve upon? It starts the dialogue where that person's now in the boat with you to try to help you kind of steer the future.
So even if you had a bad experience and saw somebody do it not the right way, it shouldn't hold a person back from saying, I should think about the aspects of branding. How I show up matters. The overall view of what I bring to this organization is being measured at some level. So even though you've seen downside of branding, you still push through and said, it can still work for me.
You absolutely have to, because otherwise they'll have their own ideas of your brand. You own your brand, and so you have to figure out with your own personal style and authenticity how to communicate that brand in an organization. And that is, how you demonstrate your work, how you communicate, how your team, leads through the organization. But if you aren't talking about it, if you aren't owning that in your own unique way, then somebody else is owning it. And if you don't ask for feedback, you have no idea what your brand is.
So what you're saying is perceptions are being formed of you, regardless of you, if you own it, shape it, and manage it. It's going to be shaped either way, regardless.
Exactly.
So why not understand that and jump out in front of that is kind of what I'm hearing from you.
Right. And you get 360 feedback. It's not always pleasant. Not everything's positive. And so, but you're better off knowing and in getting that feedback and then working on improving your brand than just letting it be out there.
Excellent. In this market, we talked about a couple of things of why it's important. The view of owning your perception, but practically in an organization, what are some of the things that really have resonated with you? Let's just take it over your time in pharmaceuticals over the last 20 years, either from positioning for the right opportunity inside, fighting for the right team members, not even fighting, attracting the right team members, understanding that budgets are limited and making sure that people understand what you're working on in terms of how this really drives the organization forward, therefore requires some dollars to do that. So in a practical sense, how has branding over the last 20 years helped you with not so much self, but really drive your overall presence and influence in an organization?
Well, I think that it's really about your vision, right, for your mission. So what's the vision and mission of your group, and how does it align to the overall organization? I think that's the number one most important thing, because then it's not self-serving. It's like, this is what our team is trying to do to contribute to the whole enterprise. So I think that's number one. I think number two is, what's your value system? So what are the values that you are trying to create. And for me, it's about the culture that you're contributing to in the bigger organization or your team. And for me, values plus operating norms, so how you behave, are really the culture you're building. So being in alignment with the values of the organization, maybe some values might be unique to your own team depending on what the team is, and then how you operate. So things like you don't appraise people publicly, you do that privately. You give positive praise, to a big group, but then privately you give people feedback. Things like that. We collaborate, we communicate. We don't rely on email. We call each other. Things of how you operate really build your culture. That's an important piece of it. And then being strategic, thinking much more broadly than your own group.
That's great. Kind of tying a thread through many things that you said. Knowing that we need to elevate beyond those bottom boxes. Quality isn't enough anymore. 20 years ago it worked. Now we push that up to a level that resonates with yourself around some strengths that you have. And you mentioned some of these things, of these examples, these environments, the lessons learned, really start shaping the person you are in terms of strengths. But that's still about you. When you start pushing beyond that and saying, really, what is the value I create for the organization, that continuum from almost quality functional view to strengths to value is an interesting migration, because then you come back and say, how do those experiences start applying to this company in this market at this time? And if a company's going through a merger or integration, you can come back and say specifically, here's how I help integrate teams more effectively than anybody else. In an environment of low budgets, here's how I get more out of my people than anybody else. In terms of disruption, you think about how to collaborate and drive thinking and innovation across the functional silos better than anybody else. So now it's just rolling this up to almost what makes you great in this time for this company in terms of what the business is trying to accomplish at this point.
I think what's key there, though, Marty, is exactly as you said it. What is the business going through?
Yeah.
So really having the ability to, read the financials, read everything you can find about the company, to say, okay, how do I step back and say, how can I contribute to the broader organization through my group, right? And working with your boss
That
and your
strategic
peers.
view that you mentioned.
Yeah.
That's great. Love it. Diane, another great conversation on branding, which every time I have this conversation with you, I learn something new from a real practical sense. So thank you for that. Again, what we accomplished today, just to make sure you understand what our objectives are, is that we understand now what you need to avoid and when you're out branding yourself, as well as why it's critically important to keep thinking about brand as you build your career inside the organization, or if chances happen outside the organization. And we're going to go into our next session around a workbook view of building your brand, and we're going to ask really hard questions that really start exposing the view of what value you create, how you're different, and how your strengths turn into value for yourself and your organization and your team. So we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks again, Diane.
Great. Thanks, Marty.